In the early 1980s, Atari was everywhere. The best-selling consoles, the biggest games, and the company that basically created home gaming as we know it. But then, almost overnight, it all collapsed. How does a gaming empire go from ruling the world to vanishing completely? Stick around, because today we're diving into the wild story of Atari, how they rose, how they fell, and what really went wrong. Nolan Bushnell and Ted Dabney. Two guys who, back in the early 70s, had a wild dream to bring video games out of the lab and into people's homes. They were both engineers, both obsessed with technology, and both fascinated by one of the first computer games ever made, Space War, a game that ran on huge, expensive mainframe computers that only universities had access to. But Bushnell had this idea, what if we could take something like Space War and make it small enough and cheap enough that everyone could play it? That's where their first project was born, Computer Space, in 1971. It looked like something straight out of a sci-fi movie, a sleek, futuristic arcade cabinet with flashing lights and a rocket ship-shaped shell. Sounds awesome, right? But here's the problem, it was not fun to play. It was complicated, confusing, and honestly, too, ahead of its time. Most people who tried it just stared at the controls and went, wait, what am I supposed to do? Computer Space was a total flop, but that failure didn't stop them. In fact, it lit a fire under them. In 1972, Bushnell and Dabney decided to start fresh. They founded a new company, one that would change gaming forever.
Atari was founded in 1972 by a 26-year-old 6'4" research engineer for Ampex.
Their goal was simple, make games that anyone could walk up to, understand instantly, and have fun with. Their first big hit, Pong. Pong wasn't exactly original. A year earlier, another company, Magnavox, had released the Odyssey, the first home gaming console, and one of its built-in games looked very familiar. A little game called Table Tennis. Pong was basically a slick arcade version of that same idea. Pong wasn't complicated. It was simple, smooth, and addictive. Players didn't need to read instructions. You'd just pick up the controller, see the ball bounce, and instantly get it. Within weeks, bars and arcades were filled with Pong machines, and they couldn't keep up with demand. Atari had turned a ripoff into a revolution. But that success also caught the attention of the one company that wasn't too happy about it.
Magnavox presents Odyssey, the electronic game of the future.
Before Atari became the face of gaming, there was Magnavox, the true pioneer that kicked off the console revolution with the Odyssey. It might not look like much by today's standards. 2 paddles, a ball, and some plastic overlays you'd stick to your TV screen, but in the early 1970s, it was groundbreaking. It was the first time people could play video games at home. But when Atari released Pong, Magnavox noticed something familiar. The bouncing ball, the paddles, even the gameplay, it looked almost identical to their table tennis game. So, what do you do when someone takes your idea and turns it into a worldwide hit? In 1974, Magnavox took Atari to court for patent infringement, demanding $1.5 million in damages, a massive amount of money at the time. Atari didn't even try to fight the lawsuit. They settled out of court, paying Magnavox the $1.5 million and officially becoming a licensed manufacturer under their patents. But even though they lost that battle, Atari had already won the war because Pong was everywhere. The game was so successful that hundreds of other companies rushed in to make their own versions. Pong clones flooded the market, bars, arcades, even home consoles. Everyone wanted a piece of the action, but that sudden success came with a problem. The market became oversaturated. Everywhere you looked, it was just more and more Pong. And when everyone's making the same thing, sales start to drop fast. Atari found themselves in trouble, financially and creatively. They had lightning in a bottle, but now it was slipping away. And by 1976, they were running out of cash. So Nolan Bushnell made a massive decision, one that would shape the company's future. He sold Atari to Warner Communications for $28 million. That move gave Atari the funding it desperately needed. And for a while, it looked like the company was saved. With Warner's money, Atari would soon enter the golden age of gaming with the Atari 2600. But little did they know that this sale would also mark the beginning of their biggest downfall. because the moment Warner stepped in, everything about Atari, its culture, its creativity, its soul, began to change. It's 1976, and gaming is evolving fast. That year, an engineer named Jerry Lawson changed everything when he created the Fairchild Channel F. The first console with interchangeable cartridges. The F stood for fun, and that's exactly what it brought to people's homes. Before Channel F, every console had its games built right in. Once you'd played them all, that was it. Lawson's idea meant players could finally swap games without buying a new system each time, a revolutionary concept that would shape the entire gaming industry. Atari quickly saw the potential, and in 1977, they released the Atari 2600. Sleek, simple, and revolutionary, it used those same switchable cartridges and instantly became the console to own. But Atari wasn't alone. The competition was heating up. Mattel entered the arena with the Intellivision, the ColecoVision by Coleco, and Magnavox returned with the Odyssey 2. The first true console war had begun. Despite the competition, Atari fought hard to stay ahead, and they had a secret weapon: game licensing. They secured home versions of arcade hits like Space Invaders, Pac-Man, Missile Command, and Asteroids. And this was a genius move. Space Invaders in particular became a cultural phenomenon, the first arcade game to sell over 1 million home copies. It didn't just make Atari money, it made them the face of gaming. Suddenly, every household wanted an Atari. By the late 70s, the 2600 was dominating the market. And Atari was at its peak, the undisputed winner of the first console war. But behind the scenes, things were falling apart. Nolan Bushnell, Atari's founder, wanted to reinvest the profits to push boundaries, develop new consoles, and stay ahead of competitors. Warner's new CEO Ray Kassar had other ideas. He didn't care about innovation, he cared about sales, fast, safe profits. Instead of building the next big console, Kassar pushed to recycle old ideas, porting Atari 2600 games onto the newer 5200 system. Bushnell hated the direction, and in 1979, he resigned. But the tension didn't stop there. A group of top Atari developers, David Crane, Alan Miller, Bob Whitehead, and Larry Kaplan, got fed up with Kassar's leadership too. They wanted recognition, but Atari refused to credit developers for their work, so they walked out and founded Activision, the world's first third-party game developer. That single move changed the entire gaming industry. Under Kassar's leadership, Atari went from being the fastest-growing company in America to the fastest-failing one. And it's at this exact moment, when Atari was already struggling to stay organized, that they made the biggest mistake in their history. A decision that would become the final nail in the coffin. June 1982, E.T. the Extra-Terrestrial hits theaters, a global phenomenon. Every kid wanted the toys, the merch, the magic of that little alien who phoned home, and Atari wanted a piece of the action. The company had already made millions licensing hits like Space Invaders and Pac-Man, so when they secured the rights to E.T. for a jaw-dropping $25 million, Atari was all in. They believed this would be the game that would save their crumbling empire. They turned to one man, Howard Scott Warshaw, the designer behind Yar's Revenge and Raiders of the Lost Ark, two of Atari's biggest hits. But there was a catch, a massive one. He had 6 weeks to create a fully playable game from scratch so it could hit stores in time for the holiday season. 6 weeks to design, program, test, and ship a blockbuster. Most developers would have laughed and walked away. But Warshaw took it as a challenge. He locked himself away, coding day and night, fueled by adrenaline and sheer willpower. And he made the deadline. By December, E.T. the Extra-Terrestrial was ready. Atari skipped testing, produced 5 million cartridges, and flooded store shelves just before Christmas. But when players got their hands on it, they were confused. There was no real story, no clear missions, just endless falling into pits, collecting strange items that made no sense. Word spread fast. Kids returned the game in droves. Retailers demanded refunds. What was meant to be Atari's savior became its curse, branded by players and critics alike as the worst video game ever made. The damage was done. Atari's reputation was shattered, their profits tanked, and the company that once defined gaming was now a punchline. And just like that, the same company that brought video games into millions of homes was brought to its knees by one small alien from space. But that wasn't the end. For E.T., the Extra-Terrestrial, what started as Atari's biggest gamble would go on to become one of the most emotional and infamous story in video game history.
No, I never would have guessed that that game would have a movie, another movie made, I guess, besides the first movie, E.T.